Hey guys, tonight we're settling in for one of those stories that's less about battles and more about being uncomfortably chilly in a big stone box. So grab your blanket, dim the lights, and let's drift back into the Middle Ages, when life was tough, winters were long, and castles looked majestic from the outside, but inside they were basically giant refrigerators. It's easy to imagine kings and queens living in luxury. Tapestries, gold, feasts, the whole deal. But here's the twist. Medieval castles were freezing cold. Not kind of chilly cold. We're talking damp, drafty, breath-fogging, why is my soup turning solid again cold. These weren't cozy winter chalets. They were stone fortresses designed to keep enemies out, not warmth in. So tonight we're going to float through the icy corridors of these castles. We'll look at how royals, nobles, and even the servants tried to keep from turning into medieval popsicles. And of course, because this is medieval history, it comes with all the usual bonus material. Questionable fashion choices, bad hygiene, strange medical theories, and the occasional royal meltdown. Because why not? Let's start with the architecture. Castles were built with one thing in mind. Defense. Thick stone walls, narrow windows, towers where you could dump boiling oil on anyone who came too close. Cozy insulation wasn't exactly a priority. Stone keeps heat about as well as an ice cube tray. In winter, the walls sucked warmth right out of the air. In summer, they stayed cool, which sounds nice, until you realized it was still cold in July. And then there were the windows. Early castles had arrow slits, which, shockingly, weren't designed for good airflow. Later, when bigger windows showed up, glass was rare and expensive. Most households had shutters or oiled cloth stretched across the frame. Oiled cloth, in case you're wondering, does not keep out drafts. So imagine sitting in your great hall while the wind whistles in like it owns the place. Lovely. Now, let's picture the centerpiece of every castle, the fireplace. Or more accurately, the desperately inadequate pile of logs on fire in one corner. Fireplaces in the Middle Ages were massive, but they had a fatal flaw. They lost most of their heat straight up the chimney. The smoke went out good, the warmth followed bad. People sitting right next to the fire might be warm on the front and freezing on the back. It was less central heating and more roast your knees, freeze your spine. Kings and queens tried to fight the cold with grandeur. They hung tapestries on walls. Yes, those giant, colorful, woven scenes weren't just for showing off. They worked as medieval insulation. A tapestry might block some of the draft. Of course, they also trapped smells, which in a medieval castle we probably don't want to think too hard about. Still, people clung to them like medieval wallpaper with benefits. Let's float over to the beds. If you've ever pictured a medieval royal bed as the height of comfort, well, you're half right. Beds were big, often carved with fancy wood, and sometimes had canopies. The canopy wasn't just decorative, it helped trap heat. Curtains around the bed turned it into a little microclimate. It was like building a pillow fort, except instead of being a kid hiding from chores, you were a duke trying not to freeze. But even the fanciest bed didn't change the fact that heating an entire castle was impossible. So people layered. Wool underclothes, heavy cloaks, sometimes even fur linings if you had the money. Imagine wearing multiple layers indoors, at dinner, while trying to delicately gnaw a roast swan wing. Not exactly graceful, but at least you wouldn't be shivering so hard the goblet slipped from your hand. The servants had it worse, of course. They slept in drafty corridors, sometimes on straw, sometimes on wooden benches. Blankets were scarce. A lot of them relied on body heat. You know how penguins huddle together? Picture that, but with medieval peasants, trying not to catch each other's lice. And then there's food and drink. Hot meals weren't just about taste, they were survival. A pot of stew simmering in the hearth wasn't only dinner, it was heat you could swallow. Ale and wine helped too, not because they actually warmed you, but because after enough mugs, you stopped caring that your nose had gone numb. Doctors of the time had their own theories, naturally. Medieval medicine loved the idea of humors and balance. Cold air? Clearly it was upsetting the balance of your black bile. The cure? Sometimes it was herbal tea. Sometimes it was bloodletting. Because when you're already weak from the cold, why not lose a pint? And yet, despite the discomfort, castles had their charm. To people back then, the cold wasn't surprising, it was normal. Life was colder, harder, and shorter overall. You made do. You wrapped yourself in whatever wool you had, huddled by the fire, and listened to the wind howl against the stone. If you were lucky, you had a feather mattress. If you weren't, you had straw. Either way, you survived. Somehow. Of course, royals being royals, they had their quirks. Some would hoard exotic furs, ermine, sable, things imported at outrageous cost just to stay warm. Others layered on jewelry, even when their fingers were blue, because fashion doesn't pause for frostbite. A few kings, famous for being stingy, refused to heat their castles properly at all. After all, why waste good firewood for servants when you could save it for next year's banquet? So, castles were cold. Everyone knew it. Everyone lived with it. And yet, strangely, there was pride in enduring it. To be noble, to be royal, was to show strength, even if that strength was mostly pretending you weren't freezing your royal backside off. And that, friends, is where we'll begin tonight's long wander through medieval discomfort. From frosty halls to miserable royal children, we'll keep peeling back the layers of life in these chilly fortresses, and we'll keep asking the same question. How did they survive it? But let's not rush. For now, picture yourself under a heavy wool blanket, inside a stone tower, with only a small fire trying to hold back the winter. The wind rattles the shutters, the floor is cold under your feet. Somewhere in the dark, a servant sneezes. Welcome to castle life. All right, so we've established that castles were about as cozy as a damp cellar. Now imagine being a royal child growing up in one. Sure, you've got jewels, tutors, and a title, but you also have the joy of frostbite before your 10th birthday. Tonight, let's float toward the nursery, where the little princes and princesses of Europe lived their chilly, uncomfortable childhoods. First things first, nurseries weren't exactly pastel-painted wonderlands. Forget cartoon murals or teddy bears. A medieval royal nursery was usually just another drafty room with some hangings, a cradle, and a harried nursemaid. Sometimes the walls were lined with wood paneling to cut down on the cold. But cut down here is relative. If you can still see your breath, it's not really child-friendly. Clothing for children wasn't any better. Medieval toddlers weren't running around in soft pajamas. Instead, they were bundled up in layers of stiff linen, scratchy wool, and if their parents were rich enough, fur trims. It was basically medieval swaddling, except less about safety and more about keeping the royal spawn from freezing solid overnight. And speaking of overnight, sleep in castles was an adventure. Royal children often shared beds with siblings or nurses, partly for warmth, partly because everyone feared the cold drafts might literally kill them. Parents worried about night air, a vague medieval concept that blamed bad air at night for sickness. Ironically, their solution was to seal the kids into cold, stuffy rooms with the windows shut. Fresh air was suspicious, warmth was impossible, and the result was lots of coughing. Now, royals weren't exactly hardy stock to begin with. By the late Middle Ages, inbreeding had taken a toll. Children of dynasties like the Habsburgs and Valois were often sickly, pale, and prone to strange ailments. Add a freezing environment, questionable diets, and medieval medical care, and you have the recipe for a nursery full of wheezing heirs. Take, for example, Charles VI of France, later called Charles the Mad. As a child, he was reportedly delicate and sickly. Growing up in cold, drafty chambers didn't exactly build resilience. By adulthood, he was having psychotic breaks and thought he was made of glass. Which is ironic, since if he had been made of glass, at least he would have held heat better than his castle. Medieval royal physicians did their best, of course. Their best usually meant leeches, herbal teas, or rubbing exotic ointments on the child's chest while chanting a prayer. Sometimes they recommended a warm bath, though warm in this case meant lukewarm and only once in a while because everyone was suspicious of water. Baths were considered risky, something about opening your pores to the deadly night air again. So no, the royal children weren't exactly glowing with health. And yet, for all their fragility, these children were spoiled rotten. Cold or not, they were still little symbols of dynastic pride. They had nurses, tutors, attendants, basically a small army of people fussing over them. Toys were rare, but when they had them, they were luxurious. Carved wooden horses, miniature suits of armor, little gilded rattles. Not that the toys helped much with the shivering. Meals were equally ironic. While peasants prayed for bread and pottage, royal children were being introduced to roast meats, spiced pastries, and heavy, rich foods. Not exactly the diet to build strong immunity. But hey, nothing says childhood like indigestion while sitting in a freezing great hall. We can also talk about education. Picture a boy of 8, nose dripping in the cold, trying to memorize Latin declensions while his tutor drones on. Or a princess learning courtly manners while her teeth chatter. Knowledge may be power, but frostbite has a way of interrupting your conjugations. Then there's the psychological side. Cold seeps into your mood. Today, we'd call it seasonal depression. Back then, it was just being melancholy. Imagine being a lonely child in a stone room, staring at a tapestry, listening to the wind howl, and waiting for some adult to come tell you that your destiny is to marry your cousin and continue the family line. Cozy bedtime story, right? Of course, not all royal children had it equally bad. Some had warm clothing imported from abroad, velvets from Italy, furs from Russia. Some castles had slightly better heating systems, like massive tile stoves in Central Europe that radiated heat for hours. But for most, the basic reality was the same. You were cold, you were fragile, and your future was decided long before you learned to walk. Take Mary the Queen of Scots as another example. She spent her early years in Scotland, already not known for tropical winters, before being sent to France. Even there, her health was a constant worry. Her attendants fussed endlessly, bundling her up, feeding her tonics, and praying she wouldn't succumb to the same childhood diseases that wiped out so many noble heirs. And that brings us to another grim point. A lot of these children didn't make it to adulthood. Cold didn't kill them outright, but it weakened them. Pneumonia, flu, fevers, all more deadly in a drafty castle nursery. Dynasties lost heir after heir, often before the age of 5. And when one child survived, parents treated them like delicate porcelain, wrapped, pampered, and smothered with attention, which explains a lot about the spoiled behavior of royals later in life. But let's not paint it all gray. There were moments of fun, even in the cold. Children sledded on frozen ponds, played with dogs, and chased each other through castle courtyards. Their laughter echoed in halls that otherwise felt more like prisons than homes. And servants, despite their hardships, often doted on royal children with genuine affection. Still, when we look at portraits of these kids, stiff little figures in miniature gowns, staring blankly at the painter, it's hard not to see the weight of it all. The cold, the sickness, the pressure, the strangeness of being a child raised as a political pawn. Their lives were not bedtime stories. They were survival tales, played out in stone rooms that could barely keep out the winter. So yes, medieval castles were freezing. But for royal children, the chill was just one part of a larger package. Fragile health, heavy expectations, and the looming shadow of dynastic politics. In other words, a childhood both spoiled and sad, where the luxury never quite made up for the draft. And with that thought, let's drift quietly out of the nursery and down another corridor. The torches flicker, the walls sweat with condensation, and the air smells faintly of smoke. Ahead lies another group of characters, the kings and queens themselves. And trust me, if you thought the children had it bad, wait until we meet the adults trying to run empires while shivering in their royal cloaks. So we've peeked into the icy nurseries where royal children shivered under their embroidered blankets. Now let's glide forward and meet the adults those children became, the kings and queens who ruled from within these drafty fortresses. Spoiler alert, if you think a cold castle makes for calm, balanced rulers, you might want to lower your expectations. Royalty was already a strange profession. Your job was essentially be born, sit on a throne, marry a cousin, produce heirs, and try not to die too fast. Now, add months of winter cold, long dark nights, bad diets, and constant drafts whistling through the throne room. What you get is a class of rulers who were not only dysfunctional by bloodline, but also perpetually uncomfortable. Let's start with one of the poster boys for dysfunction, Henry VI of England. Born into the Hundred Years' War, crowned at 9 months old, yes, 9 months, because who doesn't want a baby king, Henry was famously frail and prone to breakdowns. By adulthood, he had episodes of catatonia, where he simply stopped responding. Doctors today might call it catatonic schizophrenia, but back then, people called it God's will. Either way, imagine being wrapped in ermine, sitting in a freezing chamber, staring into the middle distance while your advisors shuffle awkwardly. It's not exactly strong leadership material. Now, Henry's breakdowns often coincided with political disasters. Was it the stress of ruling, the endless wars, or maybe the simple fact that spending your life in a cold, joyless stone castle does not make for great mental health? Try surviving a medieval English winter without central heating and see if you don't lose a bit of your spark. Then there's Charles VI of France, the one we already brushed against in the children's section. By adulthood, Charles believed he was made of glass. He wrapped himself in blankets and refused to let people touch him, afraid he would shatter. He also sometimes forgot who he was, ran screaming through the halls, or insisted on being shaved bald to feel cleaner. Now, picture him doing all this in a stone palace with cold drafts slapping him from every direction. Dysfunction and frostbite, hand in hand. The cold didn't just mess with minds, it also worsened physical ailments. Take Henry VIII later in life. The man ballooned in weight, developed ulcers on his legs, and spent his days swaddled in layers of furs while snapping at everyone around him. Imagine him in Whitehall Palace, beautiful, yes, but still cold at its core, trying to stay warm while his leg wound festered. People blamed his temper on his head injuries and paranoia. Personally, I think the constant discomfort of living in drafty royal chambers didn't exactly help. But dysfunctional royals weren't always tragic. Sometimes they were just hilariously odd. Let's take Philip the Fair of France, who was called handsome, but in the way only medieval people could find flattering. This man sat in cold council chambers, plotting against the Knights Templar while draped in fur-lined robes that probably smelled faintly of wet wolf. Handsome is a stretch. Mildly less potato-faced than his cousins is probably more accurate. Or Isabella of Castile, who became queen alongside Ferdinand. Together, they launched the Spanish Inquisition, a phrase you're not supposed to expect, but here we are. Their castles were no warmer than anyone else's, yet Isabella insisted on piety, modesty, and discipline, which sounds noble, but really meant more fasting, more praying, and less warmth. Try sleeping through the night when your monarch insists on chilly self-denial as a virtue. Then there's the Habsburgs. Oh, the Habsburgs. This dynasty perfected the art of inbreeding, producing rulers with jaws so pronounced you could practically use them as shelves. Charles II of Spain is the crown jewel of dysfunction. Sickly, deformed, unable to chew properly, his doctors kept him swaddled in furs and blankets to fight off endless illnesses. He was called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because people genuinely thought a curse explained his poor health. Personally, a freezing childhood in drafty Spanish castles, plus a gene pool smaller than a puddle, seems curse enough. Royal dysfunction often played out in family drama. Castles, with their echoing halls and lack of privacy, turned every marital spat into public theater. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, lived in cold, gloomy palaces while her husband flaunted his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Catherine tried to warm herself with layers of silk and furs, but no amount of clothing kept her marriage cozy. Instead, she poured her energy into manipulating her son's reigns. Dysfunction runs warmer than firewood, apparently. Now let's glide north, to Sweden, where cold castles were, well, even colder. Queen Christina of Sweden in the 1600s grew up in drafty Stockholm palaces. She was eccentric, refusing to marry, dressing in men's clothing, and spending her nights pacing her icy chambers, planning grand intellectual projects. People called her strange, unfeminine, or unstable. But honestly, if I had to survive a Swedish winter in a stone fortress, I'd be pacing too. The cold also magnified paranoia. Rulers were already suspicious of plots and poisons. Sitting in a frigid, echoing hall, bundled in cloaks, surrounded by half-frozen courtiers whispering in corners, it doesn't exactly scream trust and stability. Ivan the Terrible of Russia is a classic case. Sure, he had plenty of other issues, like killing his own son, but it's hard not to imagine that the drafty towers of Moscow, with frost creeping across the windows, fueled his dark moods. And then we have Louis XIV, the Sun King, who tried to escape the cold by moving his court to Versailles. Now, Versailles was beautiful, golden, dripping in art, but insulation? Not so much. The endless galleries were freezing in winter, courtiers huddled in wigs and brocades, teeth chattering while trying to look elegant. Louis himself layered up under blankets, convinced that being the Sun King meant radiating warmth, even when he was shivering inside. Dysfunction, but make it fashionable. But here's the irony. Despite all this discomfort, royals clung to their castles as symbols of power. The bigger, the colder, the better. A drafty stone hall with banners fluttering was proof of majesty. To admit it was miserable would be admitting weakness. So they put on a show, sitting tall on icy thrones, faces blank, trying not to sneeze while emissaries bowed. And honestly, maybe the cold helped in one way. It made them look more stoic. After all, if you can sit through a 6-hour council meeting in January in a stone chamber with no heating, wearing 40 pounds of velvet, you deserve at least some respect. Dysfunctional or not, they endured it. Or at least pretended to. So, dysfunctional kings and queens. They weren't just products of bad genes or bad politics. They were products of their environment. Cold, damp, drafty castles shaped their moods, their health, their decisions. Behind the crowns and the titles, they were just people trying to stay warm, often failing and sometimes going a little mad in the process. And with that, let's wander down another hallway, past the throne rooms, past the royal chambers, down into the servants' quarters. Because if royals struggled to stay sane in the cold, imagine what life was like for the people serving them. Spoiler alert, it wasn't exactly cozy. So far, we've hovered through the lives of royals' children, wrapped in fur like delicate little snowflakes, kings pacing their drafty chambers, queens brooding under tapestries. But let's be real. Most people in medieval castles weren't kings or queens. They were the servants, the cooks, the cleaners, the guards, the peasants who showed up with supplies. And if you thought the royals had it rough, well, the staff were basically running an endurance test against frostbite every single winter. Let's start with the basics. Servants didn't live in the grand chambers with carved ceilings and fireplaces the size of small cottages. They lived in corridors, lofts, or little wooden annexes tacked onto the stone walls. Drafty, cold, and damp. If the royals were sleeping with their noses red and toes numb, the servants were basically living in meat lockers. Except without the meat. Their bedding? Forget feather mattresses and velvet hangings. Most had straw pallets, maybe a thin blanket if they were lucky. Straw is fine in theory, but in practice, it flattened, collected bugs, and didn't keep out much cold. So servants slept in groups, pressed together for warmth, like a pack of half-frozen puppies. It wasn't cute, it was survival. Then there was clothing. Royals could layer silks, velvets, and furs. Servants had wool, linen, and whatever scraps they could get. Wool is warm, yes, but it's also itchy. And when damp, which was often, thanks to unheated rooms and condensation, it smelled like wet sheep. Imagine spending your days running errands for a noble household while basically wrapped in the olfactory memory of a barnyard. Cozy, in its own rustic way. And of course, servants still had to work. You can't exactly tell the lord of the castle, "Sorry, it's below freezing. I'll chop the firewood tomorrow." Cooks had to stand in cold kitchens, where smoke filled the air, but warmth never seemed to linger. Laundry workers plunged their hands into icy water. Stable boys mucked out stalls with numb fingers. And guards spent long nights standing on frozen towers, peering out into the dark, trying not to think about how much warmer life might be if they had been born peasants in Italy. But here's the thing. Servants and peasants weren't entirely defenseless against the cold. They had their tricks. One classic was simply crowding together. Family, neighbors, or co-workers often shared the same sleeping space. The warmth of a dozen bodies in one small room did wonders. Yes, it also did wonders for spreading lice and coughs, but at least nobody froze solid. Then there was food. For peasants and servants, hot food was less about taste and more about keeping your insides from going numb. Thick pottage, a stew of whatever grains, vegetables, and scraps were available, was the go-to. Add a hunk of coarse bread, maybe some ale, and you had yourself a meal that kept you warm for at least a few hours. If you were lucky enough to sneak some of the lord's leftovers from the kitchen, even better. Alcohol played a role too. Ale was the medieval hydration system. Low in alcohol, but warm and filling, it was safer than water, and gave you a sense, false but comforting, that you were warmer than you actually were. Stronger drinks, like wine or mead, made their way into the hands of servants on rare occasions, usually feast days. Nothing like a bit of liquid courage to get through another drafty winter night. Another strategy? Layers. Not the glamorous fur-lined cloaks of royalty, but layers of plain wool and linen. And sometimes servants lined their clothes with straw or scraps of cloth for extra insulation. It wasn't pretty, but then again, when you're hauling buckets of water in January, fashion takes a back seat. And let's not forget fire. Fires were life. Servants clung to them whenever they could, though they were rarely allowed the biggest hearths. The Great Hall fire was for the lord and his guests. Servants huddled around smaller hearths in side rooms, or even burned peat, dried dung, or whatever combustible material they could scrounge. The smell might not have been great, but it beat freezing. Peasants outside the castle had their own methods. Cottages were tiny, built low to the ground to trap heat, with thatched roofs that acted like insulation. People often shared space with animals, not just because they loved their cows, but because animal body heat warmed the room. It sounds unsanitary, and it was, but a cow in the corner was basically a medieval space heater. Nighttime was the real test. You'd crawl into bed wearing most of your clothes, wrap up in whatever blanket you had, and hope your breath didn't freeze on the inside of the shutters. Families slept close together, sometimes all in one bed, kids jammed between parents like little human hot water bottles. Privacy was non-existent, but warmth mattered more than personal space. And yet, despite all this hardship, there was resilience. People accepted the cold as part of life. You got up, you did your chores, you endured. Some even made jokes about it. Medieval humor wasn't exactly sparkling, but we have records of songs and rhymes poking fun at frozen toes and frosty mornings. If you can laugh at your own misery, you can get through another winter. But here's the contrast that made it sting. Servants saw the warmth of royalty up close. They carried furs into the chambers of their lords, tended roaring fires in rooms they weren't allowed to linger in, and served hot wine they couldn't drink. They knew warmth existed, they just couldn't have much of it themselves, which probably didn't help morale. On feast days, things brightened up a little. Fires were stoked higher, food flowed more freely, and sometimes even servants got a chance to share in the warmth. But most of the year, it was the same grind. Cold mornings, colder nights, and endless drafts. If there's one thing that defines servant life in a castle, it was endurance. They endured the cold, endured the work, endured the hierarchy. And in a strange way, that endurance became a kind of skill, a way of life passed down from one generation to the next. Because while royals had the luxury of complaining, servants simply didn't. So the art of staying warm, for peasants and servants, wasn't really about beating the cold. It was about surviving it with small tricks, shared warmth, and a lot of stubbornness. They knew the castle was a fortress first, a home second, and a refrigerator always. And with that, let's leave the kitchens and stables behind. Let's drift up the winding staircases, past the drafty halls, into the private chambers where royals performed their strangest, most intimate rituals. Because if the servants endured the cold with grit, the royals fought it with eccentricity. Which brings us to our next stop, the strange and dysfunctional sleeping habits of kings and queens. We've wandered through the icy nurseries, the gloomy throne rooms, and the smoky kitchens. Now, let's float into the most private space of all, the royal bedchamber. You'd think, if anywhere in a medieval castle could be warm and comfortable, it would be here. After all, this was the sanctum where kings and queens retreated after long days of ceremonies, plots, and arguments. Surely, the rulers of Europe could at least get a good night's sleep. Spoiler, not really. First of all, medieval bedrooms weren't the private, cozy spaces we imagine today. A king or queen rarely slept alone. They were often surrounded by attendants, maids, guards, physicians, and sometimes nosy courtiers who claimed the right to watch them go to bed as a mark of honor. Yes, imagine trying to drift off while half a dozen people stand around whispering about your snoring. Relaxing, isn't it? Beds themselves could be impressive. Huge four-posters, carved wood, velvet hangings, embroidered sheets. They looked luxurious in paintings. But the reality? Those draperies weren't just for decoration. They were insulation. Without the canopy and curtains, you might as well have been sleeping outdoors. The heavy fabrics created a sort of microclimate inside the bed, a medieval DIY space heater. Cozy, yes, but also stuffy, dark, and prone to smelling like whatever herbs the servants tucked in the mattress to ward off insects. Now, about those mattresses. A royal might sleep on a feather bed piled with quilts and cushions. Sounds nice, but medieval feathers had a way of poking through. You could wake up feeling like you'd wrestled a goose. And feather beds were expensive, so most households had straw mattresses instead. Even royals sometimes used them, at least when traveling. Straw was cheap, easy to replace, and just prickly enough to keep you awake at night thinking about your life choices. And then there were the actual habits. Medieval sleep wasn't one continuous stretch. People often practiced segmented sleep, 2 chunks of slumber with a waking period in between. The first sleep might last from sunset to midnight, then people woke for an hour or 2 to pray, think, or, in the case of royals, conduct a little light scheming. Then it was back under the covers for the second sleep until dawn. Imagine Henry VIII tossing restlessly in the middle of the night, ulcers aching, plotting how to get rid of his latest wife. Not exactly restful. Some royals took sleeping upright to extremes. It was believed that lying flat could cause vapors to rise to the brain and cause illness. So they slept propped up with pillows, half sitting. Which explains why you sometimes see royal beds shaped like thrones, with headboards tall enough to lean against. Good for posture? Not really. Good for snoring? Definitely not. But hey, at least the vapors were under control. Now, let's sprinkle in some dysfunction. Charles V of France, known as the Wise, apparently had insomnia. He was up all night, wandering the halls, reading or mumbling to his attendants. His physicians blamed his diet. Personally, I'd blame the fact that his bedroom was probably hovering at refrigerator temperature and his bed curtains could only do so much. Louis XI, on the other hand, was a paranoid sleeper. He filled his bed with religious relics, saints' bones, holy medals, and random charms to ward off bad dreams and assassination attempts. So if you picture him rolling over in the middle of the night, half asleep, poked in the ribs by a saint's femur, you wouldn't be far off. Royal couples had their quirks too. Some kings and queens slept apart, partly for formality, partly for warmth. Two bodies in one bed were cozy, yes, but they also generated sweat and, well, smells. Curtains kept in heat, but also trapped everything else. So sometimes the royal marriage bed was more ceremonial than practical. Queens, especially, were often expected to give birth in their chambers, with witnesses present. Privacy? Not in this century. Speaking of ceremonies, bedtime itself could be a ritual. In France, the king's coucher was a formal event. Courtiers helped undress him, handed him holy water, tucked him in, and then backed away like they were leaving a sacred shrine. Nothing says restful sleep like 50 nobles fighting for the honor of handing you your nightcap. Travel didn't help either. Royals were constantly on the move, progresses, campaigns, visits to other courts. That meant sleeping in different castles, manor houses, or even tents. Each new location brought new drafts, new mattresses, new opportunities for discomfort. Imagine being a delicate, spoiled king trying to catch some shut-eye on a straw mattress in a damp hunting lodge. Tragic. And of course, there were the furs. Royals adored piling on furs in bed. Ermine, sable, fox, whatever exotic animals they could get their hands on. The richer the fur, the warmer the sleep. Except not always. Too many layers trapped moisture, leading to clammy nights. But heaven forbid you complain. A king sweating in sable was still a king after all. Then there were the noises. Castles weren't silent. Servants clattered in corridors, guards stomped on stone floors, dogs barked, and the wind moaned through every crack in the wall. Sleep came in fragments, if it came at all. Some rulers used music, lutes, harps, chanting monks to lull themselves into rest. Others drank themselves drowsy. Either way, restful REM cycles weren't exactly common. Health problems only made things worse. Gout, fevers, toothaches, all the usual medieval ailments were aggravated by the cold. Henry VIII's ulcers, Philip II's endless migraines, Charles II of Spain's everything. They lay in their beds, bundled in quilts, moaning through another night of rest. Picture it, a royal chamber filled with tapestries, smoke from the hearth, and the sound of your monarch groaning through another night of rest. And then, of course, there were the dreams. Medieval people took dreams seriously. Messages from God, omens of the future, or signs of illness. A king might wake from a nightmare about war and immediately order a campaign. A queen might dream of a child and take it as a sign of pregnancy. No one ever stopped to consider that maybe they were just having weird dreams because they'd eaten spoiled meat before bed. But the strangest part of royal sleep habits was how public they were. Beds were symbols of power. They weren't just for resting. They were stages. People swore loyalty at the bedside. Marriages were consummated under the watch of witnesses. Deathbeds were public events, with courtiers crowding in to see the monarch's last breath. So the royal bed wasn't really a private refuge. It was part of the theater of monarchy, even if the king inside was just trying to get comfortable under 12 layers of blankets. So yes, royal sleeping habits were dysfunctional, eccentric, and rarely restful. But in a way, they reflect the bigger picture of medieval castles themselves, cold, uncomfortable, and more about appearances than comfort. A king in a freezing, drafty bed was still a king. A queen shivering under fur-lined quilts was still a queen. And in the end, that was what mattered. Status, ceremony, the illusion of grandeur. Comfort was optional. And with that, let's ease away from the royal beds, letting the curtains fall shut behind us. Ahead lies one final chapter in our wander through cold castles. We'll look at the bed not just as a piece of furniture, but as a stage where rituals, politics, and even death all played out. Because in the end, medieval life wasn't about getting warm. It was about enduring the cold with a straight face, preferably while wearing a crown.
So here we are. We've shuffled through freezing halls, smoky kitchens, drafty nurseries, and overstuffed royal beds. And now we arrive at the last stop, the medieval bed, not just as furniture, but as a kind of stage. Because, for royals, the bed was never just a place to crash after a long day of ceremonies. It was another ceremony, another performance, another layer of theater in a life that was basically one long pageant. Let's start with the simple fact that royal bedtime was public. At least public enough to make you question whether anyone in power ever had a private moment. In France, for example, the king's coucher, literally the going-to-bed ceremony, was attended by a carefully selected group of courtiers. The chosen few got the honor of watching the monarch undress and tuck himself in. Yes, that was a privilege. Imagine writing home, "Dearest mother, tonight I had the noble duty of holding the king's slippers while he wriggled under the blankets." Career highlight unlocked. And in case you're wondering, yes, there was also a leve ceremony in the morning, the getting up ritual, because apparently even crawling out of bed required an audience. Beds themselves reflected this constant performance. They weren't shoved into corners like our furniture today. They were often the centerpiece of the chamber. Elevated, draped in rich fabrics, lit by candles, sometimes with a canopy so grand it resembled a throne. Visitors didn't just see the king at a desk or on horseback. They saw him reclining on cushions, bed curtains drawn back like a stage curtain. The message was clear: even half asleep, he was still the center of the universe. And of course, beds played a starring role in dynastic duty. The royal marriage bed was a political object. Consummation wasn't private, it was witnessed. Not by the whole court, thankfully, but by a select group of officials whose job it was to confirm that yes, the marriage was indeed sealed in the most literal way. Subtle? No. Awkward? Absolutely. But without that, there was no official legitimacy for heirs. Romantic honeymoon vibes were not part of the package. Then there were births. Queens gave birth in their chambers, often with a crowd of witnesses, because everyone needed to confirm the baby was truly hers. Bed curtains might be pulled back, midwives and courtiers hovering while the queen tried to bring a new heir into the world. Privacy was not the point. Legitimacy was. The bed was essentially the stage where the future of the dynasty appeared. Blood, sweat, and all. And let's not forget deathbeds. A royal death was never private. Courtiers and officials crowded in to witness the monarch's last breath. Chronicles describe these moments in great detail, as though the king's final sigh had cosmic significance. Beds draped in black, candles flickering, priests chanting, the monarch slipping away, surrounded not by family, but by an audience. Even dying was a performance. Now, that might sound heavy, but let's not overdramatize. There were also smaller rituals. Nobles and royals swore oaths at bedside. Visitors were received while the ruler lounged in bed, propped up on cushions. Some kings conducted business from beneath the covers, which frankly sounds like the one perk of monarchy we can all appreciate. Who needs a desk when you can run the kingdom from under a quilt? Of course, not all rituals were dignified. Henry VIII, in his later years, turned his bed into a medical ward. Attendants treated his sores, changed his bandages, and tried to keep him comfortable as he grumbled through sleepless nights. The bed was less a throne and more a hospital gurney, but it was still the center of attention. And then there's the symbolism of the bed itself. Marriage, birth, sickness, death, all the key milestones of royal life happened there. The bed was a microcosm of monarchy. Tapestries might show saints, battles, or family crests, as if to remind everyone that even in sleep, the dynasty continued. The curtains weren't just for warmth, they were literal backdrops to the play. The irony, of course, is that amidst all this ritual and symbolism, actual sleep was probably scarce. The king may have looked regal reclining beneath embroidered hangings, but he was still freezing, still uncomfortable, still dealing with the endless draft of castle life. The queen may have given birth in a chamber draped in silk, but the temperature was closer to an icebox than a nursery. Ceremony wrapped around discomfort. The performance mattered more than the experience. And maybe that's the perfect metaphor for medieval castles overall. They weren't built for comfort. They were built for show, for power, for survival. And nowhere was that clearer than in the bed. The cold, creaky, oversized piece of furniture that hosted the most intimate and the most public moments of royal life. So tonight, as we draw this long, meandering wander through cold castles to a close, picture a great bed with its curtains swaying in the draft. A king inside, snoring lightly. Courtiers outside, whispering about who got to hand him his slippers. The fire burning low. The wind rattling the shutters. And history, quietly unfolding under the blankets.
Welcome back. If you're still here, then congratulations. You're either very dedicated to medieval history, or you're halfway through the kind of nap that even monks would envy. Either way, let's ease into tonight's next subject. What happened when the sun went down in a medieval castle, and how religion and superstition filled the long, dark hours. We've covered the cold, we've covered the beds, but what about the nights themselves? Imagine a castle at midnight. The torches are guttering, the fires are smouldering, and most of the servants are asleep in drafty chambers. Outside, wolves howl. Inside, the stone corridors echo with the wind. It was the perfect backdrop for, well, fear. And medieval people were afraid of a lot. Night wasn't just dark, it was dangerous. Bandits, demons, witches, ghosts, and of course, that handy catch-all explanation for anything weird, the devil. So bedtime was rarely as simple as blowing out a candle and drifting off. No, it required rituals. First, prayers. For royals and nobles, evening prayer was a fixture. Sometimes it was private, a quick mumble with a rosary. Sometimes it was communal, with chaplains or confessors hovering in the background. The goal was simple. Ask for God's protection through the night, because who knew what demons might slip in under the bed curtains? A noble might end the day by making the sign of the cross, whispering a psalm, and clutching a relic under the pillow. Sleep aids, medieval edition. Relics were a whole category on their own. We already met Louis XI with his bed full of saints' bones, but he wasn't alone. Monarchs loved surrounding themselves with holy objects, bits of wood claimed to be from the true cross, scraps of cloth, vials of oil. They were the medieval equivalent of nightlights, except instead of plugging in a lamp, you tucked a fragment of Saint Whoever under your mattress. Then there were amulets. Nobles and commoners alike might wear charms against nightmares or illnesses. These could be as simple as herbs sewn into a pouch or as elaborate as engraved talismans. Did they work? Well, no one froze to death while wearing them, so maybe yes, maybe no. Superstitions crept into every part of bedtime. For example, it was considered unlucky to sleep with your feet pointing toward the door. That was how corpses were laid out. Not the vibe you wanted in your nightly routine. Mirrors in bedrooms were rare, partly because polished metal wasn't cheap, but also because people thought mirrors could trap souls. Better not to catch your reflection in the candlelight at midnight. And then there was segmented sleep, which we talked about earlier. That long waking period in the middle of the night wasn't just for tossing and turning, it was often a time for extra prayers, the night watch of the soul, so to speak. A monk in his cell would chant psalms at midnight. A queen might whisper petitions for a healthy heir. A knight might mutter protective charms before heading back under the covers. Insomnia was spiritualized. If you couldn't sleep, maybe it was because God wanted to chat. Peasants and servants had their own customs. Some sprinkled holy water in the room. Some chalked crosses on the doorframe. Families might sleep all in one bed, not just for warmth, but also for comfort, safety in numbers. After all, if a witch showed up, at least she had to get through 6 snoring bodies before she reached you. Candles were another important detail. Total darkness was terrifying. Without electricity, once the fire died and the torches went out, you were left with blackness so thick you could almost feel it pressing in. People kept little night candles burning, or at least embers glowing in the hearth. The flicker of light wasn't just practical, it was spiritual reassurance. For royals, the bedchamber itself might be decorated with protective images, tapestries of saints, painted crosses, carvings of angels. None of it made the room any warmer, but it gave the impression of divine guardianship, because nothing says sleep well like being watched over by a stern-looking saint staring down from the wall. And then there were the dreams. Medieval people didn't treat dreams as a random nonsense. They were messages, warnings, prophecies. A king might wake from a dream about war and immediately summon his council. A queen might dream of a child and assume God was announcing her next pregnancy. Dream interpretation manuals circulated, full of charmingly unhelpful advice. Dream of fish, good fortune. Dream of fire, trouble ahead. Dream of falling, definitely demons. Of course, not everyone bought into the heavy theology. Some just drank themselves to sleep. Ale, wine, or stronger brews dulled the edge of fear and made the cold nights pass more quickly. Monks frowned on this, but monks also drank plenty of ale themselves, so let's just say medieval morality was flexible. And in the end, the combination of prayers, relics, amulets, and superstitions provided a kind of comfort blanket. Not physical warmth, but mental warmth. If you couldn't stop the cold drafts, at least you could believe St. Christopher was watching over you. If you couldn't banish the rats in the straw, at least you could clutch your rosary and hope for merciful dreams. So the night in a medieval castle was never just sleep. It was a spiritual journey, a battle against cold, fear, and the unknown. A ritualized glide into darkness, with saints, relics, and whispered prayers for company. And as we drift out of this part, imagine it. The great hall silent, the torches burned low, the king tucked under velvet curtains, clutching a relic, the queen whispering prayers for an heir, the servants curled up on straw with a half-burned candle nearby, the castle asleep, but never fully at peace.
So, while the royals tucked themselves in with relics and the servants curled up with straw and prayers, someone still had to stay awake. Castles, after all, weren't just giant stone refrigerators, they were also fortresses, and fortresses don't sleep. Night duty fell to the guards and watchmen. These were the unlucky men pacing the walls while everyone else was dreaming about fish, demons, or whatever medieval people dreamed about. Their job was to make sure no one crept in or out during the night. And in the dark, with only a torch or two flickering in the wind, every shadow looked suspicious. Imagine the scene: a watchman in a thick wool cloak, breath clouding in the frosty air, boots crunching on the battlements. The wind howls. The moat glitters faintly in the moonlight. Somewhere an owl hoots, and he jumps because for all he knows, it's a sign of witches. Night duty wasn't glamorous. It was cold, boring, and terrifying in equal measure. Guards often rotated shifts, but the hours were long.
Night watch usually started at sunset and stretched until dawn, broken into smaller watches of 2 or 3 hours each. It was the medieval version of a graveyard shift. And yes, falling asleep on the job could mean serious punishment. In some armies, that meant execution. In castles, it usually meant a beating or at least being yelled at by someone important who wasn't thrilled about being woken up. What were they guarding against? Well, sieges didn't usually happen at midnight on a random Tuesday, but paranoia never sleeps. Spies, assassins, thieves, all the fun possibilities of the dark. Castles also had internal threats, servants sneaking out, lovers sneaking in, maybe even nobles plotting something they shouldn't. Night guards weren't just security against the outside world. They were also a reminder to the inside world that Big Brother, or at least Sir Geoffrey with a rusty halberd, was always watching. Inside the castle, guards might patrol corridors, especially near the royal chambers. The more paranoid the king, the more guards you had pacing outside his door. Sometimes servants complained that it was hard to sleep with armored men clanking up and down the halls. But hey, better noisy guards than a midnight assassination. And then there were the gatekeepers. The great castle gates were locked at night, often with giant iron bolts or heavy wooden beams. A guard sat in the gatehouse to make sure no one opened them. Was that boring? Absolutely. But without him, half the castle would panic about invisible intruders. Meanwhile, towers and watchtowers gave centuries-long views of the countryside, which was mostly useless at night, since there were no floodlights. Still, the idea was that if an enemy army was dumb enough to attack in total darkness, at least one sleepy guard would spot them by the sound of clanking armor. Of course, staying awake was the hardest part. Coffee hadn't reached Europe. Tea was centuries away. Guards made do with ale or strong wine, which, ironically, made them drowsy. So instead of perking them up, it sometimes turned into a liquid lullaby, which explains a lot about the number of historical surprise attacks. Other night workers existed too. For example, the kitchen might still be active if a feast had run late. Fires had to be managed so they didn't go out completely or burn the place down. Stable boys sometimes got stuck checking on horses, especially in freezing weather. And someone always had to keep an ear out for the royal baby crying at 2 a.m. Medieval life, glamorous for no one. But the guards carried the bulk of the night burden, and because it was cold and lonely, they developed their own little customs, singing quietly to themselves, whispering prayers, telling stories to the man on the next tower over. Some even carved graffiti into the stone to pass the hours, the medieval equivalent of doodling in a notebook. Occasionally, a guard might have to deal with something real, a servant sneaking a lover into the castle, a suspicious noise in the stables, a peasant banging on the gate in desperation. These moments broke the monotony, though not always in a good way. Imagine being the guy who had to explain to a furious lord that someone let the sheep escape at midnight. The most unlucky guards of all were the ones stationed outside in winter. No amount of wool cloaks could make standing on a freezing parapet pleasant. Frostbite, illness, and misery were common. And when your pay was often just enough to buy stale bread and another cloak, enthusiasm wasn't exactly high. Still, someone had to do it, because castles didn't defend themselves. Meanwhile, for nobles, guards were part of the nightly theater. Remember Part 6, the whole bed as a stage ritual. Guards outside the chamber doors added to the performance. The king could fall asleep knowing his dignity and his body were protected. The queen could rest assured no random courtier would burst in. Guards gave the illusion of security, even if half of them were quietly dozing behind their shields. So, the castle at midnight wasn't just sleeping. It was half asleep, half alert. In the great hall, servants snored. In the bedchamber, royals clutched relics. In the towers, guards muttered prayers against falling asleep. And above it all, the cold stars looked down, utterly unimpressed by human efforts to keep danger or drafts at bay. That was midnight life in the castle. Not dramatic battles or daring escapes, just the quiet, anxious business of staying awake while the rest of the world dreamed. So far, we've painted a picture of medieval nights as cold, dark, and mostly about survival. But castles weren't monasteries. Sometimes night meant noise, light, and far too much alcohol. Because what's the point of being a noble if you can't ruin everyone's sleep schedule with a 6-hour banquet? Feasts could stretch well into the night. Picture the great hall, long wooden tables, flickering torches, the smell of roasted meat, and the sound of lutes strumming the same 3 chords over and over. Nobles in fur-trimmed robes drank from heavy goblets, while servants scurried around with trenchers of bread and pitchers of wine. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't elegant, it was loud, messy, and more than a little smelly. The problem? Castles weren't soundproof. So while lords and ladies clinked cups and argued about who had the best hunting dogs, servants sleeping in the side chambers could only roll over and hope the lute player broke a string. Alcohol fueled everything. Ale, beer, wine, and lots of it. Water was suspicious, after all. Too many people had died from drinking it, and not enough people had died from drinking too much wine. So the logic was simple. And as the night wore on, conversation got louder, songs got bawdier, and the odds of someone falling under the table increased dramatically. Entertainment varied. Minstrels sang, jesters made jokes that weren't funny even by medieval standards, storytellers spun long tales that no one remembered the next morning. Dancing sometimes broke out, though imagine trying to waltz in a drafty hall with stone floors and no central heating. Romantic, in theory. In practice, it was cold feet and sore ankles. And then there was the food. Medieval nobles loved to show off wealth with elaborate dishes. A roasted peacock with its feathers reattached for display. A pie that when cut open released live birds. A boar's head on a silver platter. These weren't exactly midnight snacks, but they sent a clear message. Yes, I own too much land and too many peasants. Please admire my stuffed swan. After feasts came the drinking games. Passing cups, making toasts, inventing ridiculous challenges. Records mention kings who prided themselves on drinking their courtiers under the table. Which sounds impressive until you realize half of Europe's nobility was probably tipsy half the time. But the chaos didn't end at the table. After a feast, nobles often retreated to more private chambers for, let's call it, extended festivities. Cards and dice, flirtations, arguments, the occasional duel challenge if someone's ego got bruised. Midnight could easily blur into dawn, with servants left to clean up the wreckage of spilled wine, broken cups, and trampled bread. Not all nighttime activity was so grand. Sometimes it was just a handful of nobles sitting around a fire, gossiping. Castle life could be mind-numbingly boring, especially in winter. So a midnight chat over ale counted as entertainment. And since gossip was the real fuel of medieval courts, these little gatherings could be just as politically dangerous as a full-blown feast. And of course, some nights weren't voluntary parties at all. They were obligations. Visiting royalty meant hosting banquets that lasted far longer than anyone wanted. Diplomatic dinners dragged on until half the guests were asleep at the table. The host smiled, poured another round, and silently prayed for everyone to leave so he could finally crawl into bed. What did peasants think of all this? Well, they mostly weren't invited, except as servants, musicians, or entertainers. So while the lords stuffed themselves, the peasants refilled their goblets and tried not to freeze in the drafty corners. For them, midnight feasting wasn't fun. It was just another shift at work. Still, these late-night events gave castles their pulse. Without them, life was just cold stone and silence. With them, the halls echoed with laughter, singing, and the occasional drunken argument about who was more related to Charlemagne. It wasn't peaceful, but it was lively. So, while guards patrolled the walls and servants shivered in straw beds, sometimes the castle didn't sleep at all. It drank, feasted, and stumbled through the hours until sunrise. A reminder that medieval nights weren't just about fear or faith. Sometimes they were about fun, or at least the medieval version of it. So we've wandered through cold stone corridors, drafty kitchens, royal beds as stages, prayers, guards on duty, and noisy midnight feasts. Now, let's talk about the ultimate medieval mood killer, illness. Because when you were already freezing, hungry, and exhausted, the arrival of disease was basically medieval life's equivalent of a horror soundtrack playing softly in the background. First, let's talk royals. Being a king or queen didn't make you immune. Far from it. Despite all the relics, prayers, and bodyguards, monarchs were still susceptible to fevers, infections, and digestive betrayals. And when illness hit, sleep was rarely an option. Mostly because medieval medicine was equal parts superstition, guesswork, and occasionally brutal. Doctors were summoned. They were often clerics, scholars, or men with questionable training, and their cures could range from slightly helpful to outright terrifying. Bloodletting was popular. The theory? Removing bad humors would restore balance. In practice, often left the patient weaker, paler, and sometimes unconscious, which some considered proof it worked. And let's not forget poultices. Medieval poultices could be herbal or, let's say, experimental. Ever tried placing a warm, wet concoction of herbs, animal fats, and sometimes feces on your chest? No? Congratulations, you probably would have survived better than a king in 1427. But somehow this was standard practice. The royal bed became a sick room. Feathers, furs, and bloodletting bowls all mixed together. Not relaxing, not peaceful, but undeniably dramatic. Sleep for the sick was complicated. Sometimes the patient would drift off in exhaustion. Sometimes the illness caused fevered tossing, hallucinations, or nightmares, particularly fun in a drafty, icy castle. And sometimes the patient simply couldn't sleep because the healer insisted on adjusting humors at 3 a.m., or the nurse had to replace ice packs, or the king couldn't stop worrying about the next day's council meeting. Servants and attendants also caught everything going around. Cold stone walls, drafts, and crowded sleeping quarters meant illness spread fast. Flu, fevers, dysentery, or worse. A single cough could ripple through an entire household. And since everyone slept together for warmth, outbreaks were basically guaranteed. Even the royal children weren't spared. Sickly princes and princesses tossed in furs while midwives and nurses hovered, administering questionable remedies. Crying, fussing, and fevers kept everyone awake. And since the birth and health of heirs determined dynasties, there was a constant layer of anxiety woven through the night. Every cough was a potential catastrophe. And then came the actual doctors, not the sophisticated kind with stethoscopes and charts, but men who carried instruments that look medieval torture adjacent today. Leeches, knives for bleeding, hot irons, all applied while the patient was bundled in furs on a cold bed. The poor noble had to trust that this combination of superstition and guesswork would cure them, or at least not kill them faster. And it often didn't. Despite all of this, people slept whenever they could. Exhaustion was the ultimate sleep aid. The sick dozed off between treatments, the exhausted guards nodded, leaning on their spears, and servants curled in whatever drafty corner offered warmth. Sleep was fragmented, shallow, and sometimes a little terrifying, but it was all they had. And don't think illness only affected the bedside. Epidemics could freeze castle life entirely. Entire households quarantined in icy chambers, fires kept burning all night, food carefully rationed, water fetched in shifts, all while the nobility tried to maintain some semblance of routine. Sleep became impossible. Fear became constant. Night turned into a long, anxious vigil. Interestingly, there was also an element of superstition applied to illness. Holy relics might be pressed to the sick, prayers recited, charms applied. Some believed illness could be caused by curses, demons, or improper alignment of the stars. So even as you struggled to breathe under fever, someone was waving a crucifix over your head or sprinkling holy water. Comforting? Perhaps. Effective? Mostly a roll of the dice. And yet, amidst all the misery, life continued. Guards continued patrolling, feasts were postponed but not canceled, and the next day castle life resumed its rigid, chaotic rhythm. Medieval nights were a delicate balance of cold, fear, superstition, exhaustion, and survival. Illness was just another layer, one that affected everyone from the king and his ferns to the lowliest servant shivering on straw. So when you picture a medieval castle at midnight, think of it as a microcosm of human struggle. Fires flickering, doors locked, torches guttering, whispers in corridors, sick nobles twisting in furs, guards pacing, servants shivering, prayers muttered, superstitions enacted, and everyone trying to survive the long, dark hours. Not glamorous, not cozy, not relaxing, but very, very human. And that, dear listener, concludes our long, wandering glide through the nighttime life of a medieval castle. From freezing stone walls to royal beds, prayers to feasts, guards to illness, we've covered it all. Lights dim, torches flicker, curtains sway in the draft, and history, like a tired sentinel, quietly endures under the cold stars.